Welcome to Stepping Into Your Leadership. I'm your host, Christine Courtney, and I am so excited today to introduce to you guys my good friend and wonderful colleague in the world of work, Jacob Tourjeman. Welcome, Jacob.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Let me tell you a little bit about my fellow curly guy over here. Jacob is a leader whose career bridges creativity, biotech, and the power of human-centered leadership. I mean, if you put those three things together in the Venn diagram, you would be right in the center of it. Let me tell you a little bit more about how those things connect for him. Jacob played a key part in scaling operations at a company called Ordeos Bio, which is how we came to know each other I worked with him a little bit in that company, helping them with some things. But Ordeos Bio is a company pioneering AI-designed mini proteins for drug discovery. He now, in his new role, serves as chief of staff and head of operations at Invert. Invert is a company that's transforming the way that life scientists work by unifying complex bioprocessing data and applying all these advanced analytics and AI to help scientists experiment faster, optimize more accuracy, and scale more reliably. Invert's mission is to turn messy, siloed laboratory data into clear, actionable insights. That's a lot for me to say. So I'm going to try to have you say it in normal terms in just a minute. But I want to talk about where the creativity part comes from too, right? So he not only is accelerating innovation across biology, biopharma, and so forth. But what I love most about Jacob is the story behind the resume. He describes himself as a former music guy turned AO biotech operator. I mean, that's so cool. A reminder, you guys, that leadership does not follow a straight line. If I learn one thing from this podcast and interviewing people, it never follows a straight line. So if you think, oh, I need to do this, then it leads to this, then it leads to this, it's always all over the place, or at least the most interesting stories are. So throughout his career in high growth, high complex environments, Jacob has built a reputation on scaling teams, strengthening culture, and leading with dignity and respect. As he recently wrote, treat employees with respect and dignity, not just perks. It is a philosophy that shapes how he builds organizations and how he shows up as a leader every day. Today, we will dive into that journey a little bit, the unexpected pivots, the lessons along the way, and the practical wisdom that he brings to teams that he serves. So, Jacob, welcome to the show. And now, please explain in your own words all of the magical things you are doing at Invert.
Thank you, Christine. And yeah, happy to explain. I feel like I'm a really good translator for science to non-science. So
There you go.
the easiest way to think about what I do at Invert is actually in relation to what I did at Ordeos. So if Ordeos is trying to develop this drug candidate, something that might be a drug, but it's really early on, Invert is the next step. So once that drug candidate seems really promising, you have to scale it up a ton. And that's done in these huge facilities called bioprocess facilities. They look like a warehouse. And those facilities right now are full of machines, and tons, thousands and thousands and thousands of data points come out of those machines. And it's stuck in an older time where people are manually pulling that information and none of the machines are connected and there's no live dashboards. So what Invert is doing is unifying all that data to one software piece that a scientist can look at and see in real time what's happening across the entire facility as it relates to those scale-up runs. And then afterwards, be able to use AI on that data to have better runs in the future to understand how we got to the result at the end of the run. So it really moves the drug forward in a different way.
So how long has Invert been in business?
That is a great question. Invert has been around since 2021. They're a Y Combinator company, and it's different than my last company. It's more of a software, Silicon Valley style business.
Interesting. Are they based out of New York or?
It's remote. So it's a lot of people in California, but there's people all around the country.
Wow. How many people are you chief of staffing? How many people
Yeah,
are in the business?
Invert is 37, I believe, right now. Mhm.
Awesome. Well, that's exciting, Jacob.
Yeah,
I'm
thank you so
excited
much.
to see how where this leads in your journey and what you guys are able to do. It's amazing what's going on out there, people. Let's find out a little bit more. Here we go. So here's my first question because it's related to that. You're at the intersection of biotech and AI. So how do you lead teams when that science is kind of changing every day and you have those pressures coming from that side?
Yeah, I think it is certainly one of the hardest things that I've discovered over the last 6 years is nothing is certain and nothing is constant in science. Ultimately, what you're doing when you're discovering something new or innovating this way is you're testing a hypothesis, which very much could fail, or another company could solve it, while you're doing it. And this has happened over and over. So what I've found that's really important culturally that has to happen top down is leaning into the joy of being a scientist and the joy of having a hypothesis and testing it for the sake of testing it. So that means when things do fail, because they will, right? You have a set of experiments, one of them will fail. You have to find joy in that and being like, okay, what did we learn from it? And yeah, I think you have to foster that in the team through a shared sense of curiosity about why did we fail or why did we succeed? I think that's where it starts.
Do you find because you kind of have to hold that, do you find that difficult with the competing pressures of like the business side, but also just working with a bunch of folks who have a different kind of brain, like how do you do that?
Yes, I find this really hard. You can't you can't operate fully in the same way that like an academic institution or a research institution operates. Like you can't just say, all right, everybody, try every idea you have, innovate no matter what, because ultimately you are under certain budget constraints or timeline constraints. You kind of have to answer for how you use your time and resources. So I think the most important thing then as a leader is making those constraints extremely clear to the team. And early on, like, here's exactly what we need to deliver and when. Here's how much, I don't necessarily say here's how much money, but I say, like, this is how many experiments, like rounds of experiments we can afford. And then once we've given that constraint, I think it's really important to let them loose on the problem and not try to constrain their solutions towards that once within the constraints.
That's interesting. It's a kind of, I guess, transparency that really could go across any kind of business, right? To be able to show them here, let's pull the curtain back on what's the numbers behind this.
Absolutely. And even like, I think it's important to share with them, like, here's how we will speak about our findings with the board or with the partner. Like, you can't leave them in the dark on how the business is going to operate within the scientific framework they're working within, or it's a recipe for disaster.
And how do you, I mean, some of those folks I know are quite introverted. How do you get them talking about this stuff, working together as teams? Like, how do you, because I know I've seen you in action with them and you're always, gently pushing them a little bit outside of their comfort zone that way too, right? Because there's the team aspect. How do you do that? Like, what are some,
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard because if you don't do it, you end up with the most confident, loudest scientists in the room and you go with their view, which is maybe right, but maybe not. It's hard too, especially with remote work, even more so if people are joining from Teams calls. So what I find really, really helpful is some form of whiteboarding, whether it be physical whiteboarding because you're actually together or like a Miro, like a virtual whiteboard. And then once you're there, having an actual blank page, maybe there's a question we're trying to answer and giving people time, like sitting in awkward silence for 5 minutes and saying like, in this time, write down your thoughts and then letting them post it. And then I go through them. And, maybe I'll do some process to whittle those down. Like people vote after they've read all of them on the most interesting ones. But you have to give introverts time and space to get their ideas out. That isn't just everybody in a round table talking because it doesn't work for them.
yeah. Yeah. And do you often lead those kinds of meetings around the innovations or around the science part?
Yeah, that's what's so interesting is I facilitate all of those conversations because everyone else at the company is a scientist. And so even like the CEO, Dave Longo, is ultimately like an engineer and scientist. So it's better for him to participate in the discussions. And for me, it's important that I am giving the guidance and facilitation framework such that they can have the best scientific collaboration possible.
Wow. And so as a facilitator, and I think this is really important for all of you out there to hear, because we're often put in a situation of managing a process that is not necessarily or where our background is or what we think of on paper as our strength. But being a facilitator doesn't mean you have to be an expert in that. You have the experts in the room. So can you give us like a couple of tips on facilitating groups that maybe you're not an expert in? Because I think that that really translates to a lot of folks out there that have to lead teams.
Yeah, this has been such a learning process as I've slowly learned more about protein engineering and chemistry over the years. So, what I like to apply design thinking, which is, I don't know where the concept comes from originally, but I learned it at Stanford, design thinking to actually how I do facilitation in these planning sessions or brainstorming. So that means in advance, I do have to do work. I have to meet with the end users, which in this case are the people who are going to be doing the brainstorming. And I need to know the ideal results for them of the brainstorm. Like, what are the things that they want to come out of it with? What is the information they have? What is the information they don't have? What are their pain points and what are their frustrations? And I need to find a way as a facilitator to create the right framework after I've had those conversations that not just asks the question, but has some kind of flow that gets to the real root causes we're trying to solve for, because they're not going to naturally find that. They're just going to immediately go into technical details. And it's sometimes not important because they can always do that when they get to the end of the process. But yeah, so my goal is to ask the right questions and give the right framework for them to work within.
Yeah. What happens when they start going into the technical space and you start feeling like, oh my God, I'm a little bit lost here? How do you bring them back to the bigger picture?
Yeah, I rely on norms for that and process as much as sometimes you want to just let people just let them talk about it. And every once in a while it's the right answer, but I found that most often you need norms. So we have certain norms of saying hey, let's move that to overflow, which is the end of the conversation, which is just when we're getting in too deep and maybe it's actually only going to end up involving 2 people out of the 19 people in the room.
Good. Yeah.
And people will say it. I'll say it, but other people will also flag and be like, oh, I think we should move this to overflow. And that's just been a norm we've developed over years.
And then do you come back to that? How do you keep yourself disciplined to look at that?
So often we use this in stand-ups too, daily stand-ups, but often we'll just keep a tracker, some kind of, it's kind of like a parking lot, the idea where it's just write it down in a bullet list. And then if you don't get to it at the end of the meeting, just tag the people who should have that conversation and say, hey, we need you to handle this offline and make a task for it based on your conclusions.
Great. And I love that we use a parking lot thing. We're not always great about getting back to those things, or I kind of lose track of them sometimes, but I love the idea of putting it into a tracker that you or somebody else, can kind of monitor and then use as a task list or a way to set up another. You talked about something that was interesting, though, that I have a lot of companies ask me about, which is the stand-up meeting. So that kind of just flowed off your lips. So I thought maybe you could share with folks, what is a stand-up meeting? How long is it? How do you set it up? What's its purpose? Why do it? Because it's really used in a lot of startups, but also certainly with scientists as well. So why don't you share some of that?
Yes, I love this question because it's something that I've implemented on all the teams at Ordeos, even ones who were like, oh, we don't want to do this. And now everyone loves their stand-ups. So what is a stand-up? A stand-up is called a stand-up because originally you actually stood up for the duration of the meeting. And that was to ensure that it was short. And if some people start sitting, the meeting needs to end. It comes from the tech software world, specifically San Francisco startups.
Agile, I think.
Yeah,
or something, right?
yeah. But that's where it really became a known thing, is in the Agile framework. But the idea is every day, or maybe it's 4 of the 5 days, but every day you have this short meeting. Ideally, it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, where everyone on a certain team, ideally no bigger than 10, goes around and says, here's what happened yesterday. Here's what I'm working on today. And any blockers, anything I'm running into that's slowing me down or might make it so that my work can't move forward. And you do not go into deep discussions. If deep discussions start coming up, you say, okay, let's move that offline for after. And everyone goes around and it's short updates from each person. And it's the idea of not needing so many other meetings and checkpoints throughout the day, because the team can stay synced up from that point early in the day until the next day.
How long? So you're doing it every day with some teams? Okay. And how long are they?
It depends on the team, because some of our teams are a little larger now. So the machine learning team have It's scheduled for 30 minutes, but they usually get through the stand up in about 15, and then they do some technical discussion after. The lab team takes about 30 minutes because they're also occasionally going through, like, we did get these results, and they'll quickly go through that. It's just tailored to each team, but no longer than 30 minutes.
Okay, and you're remote now, so for the most part. So are they doing this at their computers, and it's just a timed meeting? Because that's also interesting, right? That's
Mhm.
they're presumably they're not standing up at their desks,
Right.
although I guess they could be walking
They don't.
around, or
It's
they
just a name
don't.
now. Yeah. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. So like the machine learning team is fully remote, so they're logging into a Teams meeting. And then there's kind of complicated with the lab team because they're in person because you have to do that work in person, but they call in a camera so that like I can join too and see where things are. And so it's a hybrid style. But yeah, they're all timed.
Okay. And who does someone on the team run that, or do you?
So traditionally in stand-ups, it's run by a scrum master.
Mhm.
We've slowly eliminated that concept. I don't think it's 100% necessary. So it's instead run by the team lead of each of those
Right.
teams.
And if you haven't heard the term scrum, that comes from, well, originally it comes from rugby, I think.
Yeah, it
In
does.
terms of that time where all they're holding up against each other, everybody's together with their heads together in the scrum before the play starts. And I think Agile also used that term originally and kind of moved it to business. So sometimes people, I will say, okay, well, let's do a scrum for this, which can sometimes even be a 5-minute meeting if you are standing up in your office, but something that's quick where you could talk about some of the problems that you're dealing with, so that if somebody hears of a problem, and a lot of software engineers will use this too, right? I'm working on this problem, and somebody across the room will be like, oh, I've had that before. And then you can have them meet sometime separately to go through it. But what I think is so great is not just in cultures like yours, but in all of our businesses, those things are really helpful. And a stand up meeting, to your point, is quick, but it can save you a lot of time during the workday, especially for remote folks.
Absolutely. And there's generally so much to learn from the software world about the way they manage technology development that can be applied to other businesses.
Yeah, that's true. When you think about your team at Ordeos, what are your kind of non-negotiables of your leadership culture?
Yeah, I think it's funny. It's a mix of mine and my CEO's as far as like kind of how we've melded over time. So some of my non-negotiables are pragmatism. And so I think I mentioned this earlier, but like we have constraints and we have timelines and we can't be idealistic and just shoot for everything. We have to have like, here's what we're doing. Here's the practical step forward. So I think pragmatism is something that is non-negotiable throughout our team. And then I think the other really big one is curiosity. And that means everything from, okay, like I said before, like, we failed, why? We succeeded, why? It means also like not letting anything be a black box. One big thing that's at Ordeos, if someone just says like, that won't work, we don't, it's just not acceptable. And, sometimes it's even like kind of gruff in the response. Like, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's not, we have to dig into that, right? We're not gonna take that answer. Or similarly, someone just says like, here's how we've done it. Here's how this science is done. We're going to pick apart that process and try to find the best way for us to do it. And that's being
I love
curious.
that.
Yeah.
Because every business needs to hear that when you're, especially when you're trying to invent something, right? You're trying to create something that doesn't exist. But all of us can learn that, because I've seen so many brainstorming sessions where people immediately, and it's some of us old timers that always are like, we've done that before, back 15 years ago, or that won't work. And, it's hard because sometimes that's right. And it's also immediately stops possibility, because sometimes it may not be exactly what they said, but there may be a gem inside of there. So I think it's great, because in your world, it's especially true, but we can all learn from that. I'm just curious, in this new AI landscape, everybody right now is looking at like, oh my God, how are we using AI? Or we're not using it, or we should be using it, or how is it going to affect us? Or are we losing our jobs? Or all these things that come up when we start talking about what AI is and how powerful potentially the next 5 years could be. And I was just curious, in your world, which to me as an outsider seems very technology focused and future looking. I mean, even the fact that we've been talking about proteins, and maybe we should just take a moment to explain to people what that really means in terms of what you're doing, because you guys are designing these mini proteins. But what is that can treat disease? But what does that really look like first? And
Yeah.
then,
Yeah. So proteins is just it's a form of way to talk about like the candidates for potential therapeutics. So when I say we're generating proteins, we're generating a preclinical drug candidate that could then eventually move to clinical trials and go into patients.
Yeah. And really, I know a lot of this stuff is confidential, so I don't want to share it, but the things that they're looking at treating are quite remarkable and really inspiring. Like, I love working with your company for that reason. Like, talk about big missions and big life changing work. But with that in mind, how do you see that AI fitting into the landscape of your business? Because so many people are wrestling with this for their businesses right now.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting because you'd think that everyone at Ordeos has been using AI in their individual workflows for years, but that's not the case. So even though my engineers they've built AI models and used them, really it's been this last year that we're like, okay, how do we incorporate other forms of AI like GPT or Gemini, these LLMs into our workflows?
Mhm.
And that's been a big initiative. The way I think about it, and I think this is very personal right now, individualized, I think about AI as a partner to myself. So I don't necessarily have a bunch of automated workflows that are running every week and doing jobs, but I do use AI for kind of like what I was talking about earlier, actually. Like, okay, maybe the design thinking framework for a meeting, I'll input into AI all the things that I learned by speaking to the end users who I spoke to about what they would want. And I'll say, hey, here are the requirements. Here's the framework I have. We have like an hour for it. How best might I split up this meeting to be a really effective brainstorm? And then, maybe I take some of that because I'm like, oh, that's helpful and it helps me get unstuck. And then the rest of it I do based on my own experience. So it's a thought partner. And I think the same thing is true for our engineers for coding, right? They'll do a specific function of a certain part of their code they have to write using AI, or the biologist will use it to research a hard problem. It's a partner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you just made me, when you were talking about design thinking, we studied it at our company a number of years ago. We focused on IDEO and some of the work they were doing, but definitely out of the Stanford program. And I think I want to have you on separately, just with a couple of people, to talk about the design thinking model and how to use that in your approach if you're a manager or a leader, because it can be really
Mhm.
powerful. And in the meantime, for those of you listening who are interested in what that means or more of the specifics, we'll put some of the notes about design thinking and using it for a meeting process in the show notes if you want to see that. Jacob, the other thing that I know about your life is that your background comes from the arts, as does mine. And I was just curious, kind of one lesson from your own career or your background that reshapes how you lead, because you're not exactly the normal candidate on, in terms of your background to be a chief business officer at a biotech company, right? And that's what I also love about you, is that you're so curious yourself. You're so ready to jump in and work with these folks and so forth. But what do you think, tell people a little bit about your background personally and how that affects how you lead.
Sure. Yeah. So my background was originally, my undergrad was in music, and I was often a music director, a conductor, an arranger, a composer, and a singer. And music was my first love. And that's what I did after that as well. I used to work in a studio as a producer. And then I was also a music educator for a while, working with middle schoolers, teaching them about music. And some people have asked me, like, oh man, do you regret that? Because it's a very different direction that I'm in now. And the answer is no. I love everything that made me. And I also love what I'm doing now. And I think it's made me approach everything in a very different way than I would had I not had that.
Yeah. How do you think those skills weave into what you do now?
It's strangely not that different because for so long, for so much of my music background, I was a music director and a
Mm.
producer. And your job in that way, or even a conductor, is to take a room full of incredible musicians, of really talented people with ideas and skills, and make them play something together. That's a singular thing that combines all of them, and to give guidance to facilitate it. And it's what I do now. It's really not different. It's just the players are different. It's not singers. I'm working with scientists. And
Love
yeah.
it. Yeah, right? It's just the players that are different. You're still conducting, you're still directing. It's the same skills. And I think so many folks out there, no matter what background you have to really look at what are the skills related to all these things I've studied in my life, and how does that relate to how I can be really good and step into that in whatever field I go into, because there could be many people that would have not taken up this opportunity to be a leader in the company that you're in, or they would have been nervous or scared. And to watch you do it is so great. And you do add this extra special spice, I'll say, to the group. And also he's an amazing singer. So sometimes in a great offsite, he's been known to croon a few tunes for the
Yeah.
for the team, which is great. So as we close out today, and there's so many more things I could get to, but what's something that's like maybe your favorite leadership book out there that you would tell people that this is a great one to read and something you learned from it?
Yeah. Can I give two? Because something you just said. Okay.
Sure.
So I was so based on what you just said, the thing about finding this thing that drives you through if you have multiple career paths or interests. I loved Marcus Buckingham's Love and Work book, and this whole concept of red threads. It changed the way I think about myself. I used to think of this like, oh, I had a career pivot. And instead it like encouraged me to look at like, no, what are the things that always drove you to choose what you were doing? Define those. And those are your red threads you're going to follow throughout your life that keep you passionate and loving the things you do. So that was I recommend reading that. And then another that is it's just a really practical, pragmatic leadership book, especially for operators, people who are in any kind of COO-like role or anything like that, is a book called The Friction Project. It's by Huggy Rao and I think Robert Sutton, Stanford professors. And I say it's pragmatic because it really just encourages you to actually find all the things slowing your teams down or causing friction, whether that's human, problems, people having issues with each other, or supply chain issues. And like, it just reframes the entire operator role as your job is to make all of that smooth, or to introduce purposeful friction where people do need to slow down and zoom out and take a beat. And I just found it's a great framing for that kind of leadership role.
That's cool. I'm gonna read it. I always think I've read every leadership book that's out there, but you just gave me a new one.
Yeah.
I'm excited. I'm gonna try it. Jacob, thank you so much for joining us today. We will, like I said, guys, we'll get Jacob back here to talk more specifically about design thinking and how he's using it every day in his meetings, because I think it can help all of us. And Jacob, is a pleasure.
Thank you so much. This was lovely. Thanks, Christine.